Salute, omnes, I am Ruminous, and today we are doing a review for Phoenotopia. Phoenotopia starts off like most heroes' journeys, where a girl in a small village ventures off to find her brother, then the entire village gets captured by aliens and we need to pummel some giant spiders. Much like its inspirations, Gale, the main character, is voiceless, but has character in her animations and physical reactions. The game will then lead the character into dungeons and forgotten cities of the ancients. After the village gets stolen, an alien uses a robot head to explain that this is actually the devious plot by Fox McCloud to destroy Earth, and Gale needs to get an ancient weapon of mass destruction to stop it. So we venture out to find the key to the ancient city and how to get these weapons. My full 100% playthrough on the hardest difficulty, which before the patch was the standard difficulty, took about 40 hours, but it could easily be beaten in about 15 on your first playthrough just for the main story rush, or about 25 if you're playing on a lower difficulty and getting extra combat boosts. There are some extra challenges which I have not completed as of this video, like beating the game without any stat upgrades, but those shouldn't take too long after beating the game the first time and knowing the tricks. This game honestly has a problem with consistency in its controls. The two big ones I noticed were jumping, where Gale decides to not jump frequently and just fall down off a ledge, and the other was turning around mid-air, where sometimes she turns around after a short time, other times she just never turns around at all, afraid of the boogeyman behind her. I tested it a few times to see if there were certain parameters to this, and there isn't. Sometimes Gale will refuse to jump, other times where she decides to flow backwards for no reason. The sprint also has some issues where it does not activate, but it was less noticeable. For a platforming action game, the jump and attacking controls are vastly used, and thus severely hurt the experience as I was consistently missing or had to spend extra time after falling down after a large chasm. I would like to point out that this is for the PlayStation port. I don't know if this is true for the Switch, the Xbox, and the computer. Maybe it's just the port that has these problems, but that's what I noticed, at least for my playthrough. Otherwise, the controls work consistently as far as I could tell. L2 is often used to recover or cancel after a knockdown, but even spamming the button had it fail often. Players can cancel and repeat attacking actions pretty much instantaneously, however, movement actions do have some punishment if used incorrectly. The player can cancel rolls after a second and decrease the height of jumps, but the momentum of a jump does need a bit before changing direction. Sprint jumps cannot be controlled, so be certain before leaping off a cliff into the frogs who will smother you to death. The attacking actions have a slight build-up before they become active, so it does become frustrating when you see the bats start to swing, but the enemy moves or strikes first. The jumping attack in particular takes a moment to start up and makes the player time the jumping attacks very strictly. There is some planned latency in the game between actions. Even though the character can cancel out an action, it will take a second or so to change into another action. When charging up a weapon, it will take some time before the player can save the attack or cancel and make evasive maneuvers against the onslaught of beetles. Most attacking actions have a slight cooldown or build-up before becoming active, whereas the movements will be instantaneous. This can get severely annoying in later fights where there are so many enemies, but stopping an attack to evade an enemy is nearly impossible. The game constantly uses the various controls for its levels, enemies, and puzzles. The levels are clearly designed so that the various tools can be used, or so that the enemies can be killed with the various styles of attacks. There are plenty of enemies, obstacles, and challenges that the player will have to use the various attacks and movements throughout the game. The controls are often useful throughout the entire game, although some are obviously more important than others. The crouch or crawl is really only useful for accessing secrets, as most enemies will be on the ground to attack, and you can't evade an attack on the ground by being on the ground. Ground plus ground equals no, it doesn't work. Jumping, rolling, attacking, and eating are all very useful for navigating the world and recovering health after you've upset the bees and they come to reorganize your closet. Seriously, leave these bees alone. Also, screw the beetles, I hate them so much. They are scum. The different tools each have a use, although I will say that the regular bombs are practically useless in combat as enemies will kick them away or just ignore them. The regular and upgraded slingshot are also generally useless as they do hardly any damage and take too much time to line up. Each player will have a different style and find different uses for each action, but the vast majority are useful throughout the entire game and not used as a gimmick for certain sections. The game has pretty much open autonomy for the most part. It will take away the camera randomly where it shouldn't, and there are plenty of long cutscenes. The camera theft is rare, but annoying as activating the trigger will activate it every time. Even though I know what the Switch does, you don't need to keep reminding me every time I walk by it. Yes, I know I failed. Stop reminding me. The cutscenes instead will happen quite frequently, yet are not intrusive on the first playthrough, although can be obnoxious on the speedrun challenge or secondary playthroughs. The game's movement is slightly turn-based. The player can perform the different actions whenever they want, but the build-up to the attacks does make the player have to time and plan their attacks rather than react. It can thus feel clunky and mismanaged, especially when the enemies can just pick up Gale and throw her into a corner like a stuffed animal. The speed for the game is pretty decent. There are issues where some areas are long and set in the scenes. The speed for the game is pretty decent. There are issues where some of the areas are long to set in the scene, but wear off in their welcome. Most areas can be crossed at about 15 to 20 seconds in a sprint, while the dungeons may take 45 seconds or so due to the enemies, obstacles, and need to get radioactive kickballs. The overworld is similarly easy to navigate, although stamina drains so quickly and takes forever to build that running from area to area, especially when collecting all items, becomes a chore and a drag. The view is a 2D side-scroller with the character fixed in the center but on the lower part of the screen. The view can actually be changed in most rooms to zoom in or out if the player finds the widescreen too stifling and overwhelming. The view is enough to see all around and plan for whatever giant beast is hiding in the corner. I never used the feature, but I think zooming in actually makes the view too small, but the player can choose what they want to do. The growth is generally fine, but does hit weird spikes and changes that can easily be frustrating. Since it is a Metroidvania, all the dungeons are designed pretty well with a balance of requiring the special tools or upgrades. The growth after the scorched lands is far too intense. Enemies hit so much harder, there are 50 billion of them that will stun lock you, and the levels become way too large and the player never has stamina. The good news is that these Cretans love to launch Gale down into the abyss or into spikes to make it way worse. The flow is generally stable and linear, but each area does make the new tool too necessary, where the novelty quickly wears off after I hear the sizzling of these damn bombs for so long that it haunts my dreams. The tower sections quickly grow old too, as sitting, waiting for stamina to recover constantly gets real old, especially when I fall down. The growth is often hindered significantly towards the end, where the challenge is no longer skill, but how long the player can survive an onslaught before having to restart for the millionth time. The puzzles will still be pretty short and simple, although there are plenty in the last area and secret area that just drag on for too long. The cutscenes before the final boss can't be skipped, which can be annoying when I get stun locked into death for the 10th time and I have to redo all of it, and it seriously ate so much of my time. I played this game on the highest difficulty, which was the normal difficulty before the patch came out, and I can say that I mostly had a good time with it until the very end. The game is difficult by nature, and a difficulty patch did come out to help ease out some of the harsher limitations in combat and the puzzles, but it is doable. The game is designed to be more strategic and turn-based than a Mega Man style hack and slash. I was able to beat a majority of the bosses within 1 to 3 attempts, but once you get to the caves, hold on to your ponytails. The caves and sphere are filled to the brim with hostiles and obstacles, and it quickly becomes overwhelming. I will say that the nest and spawn points can be destroyed, but doing that every time after death or re-entering the area becomes annoying, which means that I don't want to go back there. The bosses, likewise, ramp up in frustration as the challenge is no longer dodge, attack, but dodge, get stun locked, frantically jump in the air and swing, miss, have your wife leave you for another man, dodge. There are so many enemies and hazards on screen that it becomes so annoying because you can either fight the minions or the boss, but not both. Or you just need to buy a bunch of Miranda or stuff that recovers your stamina pretty quickly, and again, having a requirement for that is pretty annoying. It means that your base game isn't designed for this fight. I played the secret area and secret boss after beating the game, and I didn't really have any problems since they were well designed like the rest of the game. All of the upgrades and progress at the end of the game are nullified by how expansive the levels are, how many enemies there are, and the minions in the boss battle. I know this was done to balance the upgrades, but it's too much and makes the game frustrating rather than challenging. The game is quite sustainable throughout. It has plenty of secrets, upgrades, dialogues, jokes, and generally things to make your brain happy while you try to find a few more dollars just to get the stupid fishing rod so you can spend your life fishing away. The puzzles are fun and actually a challenge at times, and the levels are unique and beautiful. The story is intriguing enough and the difficulty stays on par until the very end. The issue I had was that the platforming requires stamina, and trying to play the game on a second playthrough can become daunting when thinking of how often Gale needs to take a tea break before getting out of the water. Because of the upgrades and shortcuts, the game has plenty of replayability for personal challenges or speedruns. The story is the generic hero's journey. Unlikely girl gets a call to adventure and discovers something larger than herself. Actually, everything's larger than her. Why is everything so huge? The village gets space snapped while Gale is away, and her mission becomes to stop the alien invasion and get her peaks back. It takes her all over the country, into the ancient war zone and into the ancient cities. In the journey, she learns that the ancients decided to genetically modify weapons of mass destruction, and that is why the world is so ravaged. Turns out the ancients left Earth because they destroyed the planet because of their machines, and now they wander the stars. There's a bunch of lore and a revelation at the last area of the game that details how they knew they messed up. The story, although similar to plenty before it and actually quite similar to my own, is filled with humor to help make the long cutscenes cutscenes more enjoyable. The game doesn't take itself too seriously and often makes fourth wall jokes about how it's so insane to live in a world where birds steal all your money. The story itself is engaging and intriguing, but could add a bit more to the main line, as it does large drops of lore at a time and can feel impersonal to Gale since no one really talks to her outside of the main cities. The music, just like the Flash game, is absolutely banging! Silly the Willy is the man at mashing the 8-bit style with modern loops. The music is likewise bombastic and over the top, but is memorable and catchy. The music for the bosses is intense, for the cities it is calm, and for Thomas it is weird just like the man himself. The music fits the theme of the situation or area and is a delight to listen to, although this masterpiece here didn't make it from the Flash game. The sounds follow suit. They are not typically realistic but cartoonish. I think some of the sounds could have been changed, like the splashing sound as if I dropped an ice cube into water instead of a whole woman, but it's not really a bother. Each action has a unique sound to help the player know what is going on in case they can't see it happening or want those menacing footsteps of Gale's incoming rage. The music and sounds mesh well, although there were points where the music was too loud and in multiple bosses where the sound got all sorts of garbled because it didn't really know what to process because there was so much going on. The game has some issues with reliability in its mechanics, but mostly it's fine. Not all are harmful, but they can cause distrust in the game. Some bosses will skip their intro after getting demolished so that Gale can wallop them, others will force players to smash the buttons to skip the dialogue to get to the vengeance. When jumping into the abyss, Gale will sometimes take damage, other times not. I couldn't really figure out any rule or hint why, it do how it do. Save points are generally at the start and end of each level and also in cities, except for the secret city for some reason. There are teleporters for fast travel, but they don't go to every area and make backtracking sometimes obnoxious, as there is no fast way to get there when all I need is one stupid drake tail. The game generally follows the standard procedure for puzzles, bosses, progression, but will have oddities where it doesn't match every so often, but sometimes that's the design feature and switches it up a little bit to add some growth. The game has a plethora of manipulatives considering that it is an upgrade game, and the player can't turn off some of these upgrades after getting them. Gale can learn new attacks, increase her stats, and get new weapons. After an accessibility patch, the player can also mess with certain actions in the game, generally to make it easier, but some are there to help with catching these heinous sharks who invert my controls and make my brain hurt. Poor planning was done for the efficiency on the NPC dialogue for stores, challenges, and story. There should have been quicker options to retry a challenge or buy equipment, as having to skip through all the dialogue gets real annoying. I know that barley beans are there and how much they cost. I'm bleeding out and need to fill my wounds with delicious beans. Most of the assistives help with movement but not with combat. The player's sprint jump and hover boots will give a little bit extra height, and there's no fall damage, which is helpful for how often enemies will rocket Gale off a ledge. After getting hit, Gale will be generally invulnerable to that particular enemy for a bit, but after a stun lock will become fully invincible to help the player deal with the savage beatdown that just happened. The game is at least fair in that the bosses and enemies can be stun locked as well, although the timing and stamina for it make it difficult for the player to do. The player's jumps don't often have to be entirely accurate, as landing on the edge close enough will work. The game is nice enough to automatically heal Gale to have health whenever running past save points. The detrimentals in the game are mostly centered around the combat, with the biggest one being that Gale can be stun locked and lose a large chunk of health. Consecutive hits will lose their strength, forcing the player to back off for a second. Stamina will recover, but only so long as it had not been used in the past 2 seconds or so, which is actually hard to do considering how much Gale needs to evade these attacks. The game does have a defense always win mechanic where the enemies will always hit Gale during a clash, and it gets annoying in a later game when enemies strike with the power of an asteroid. There are plenty of guided mechanics to help the player not only progress, but also figure out secrets. Most secrets are easy to tell by the cracks in the wall, small gaps in the ceiling, or enemies just going through hollow walls. The ladders, switches, and required items are all within clear sight, and you know things are about to get real when there's a long hallway with no music in the background. There are a fair bit of intuitives as well, where it'll explain some eventually, but not all of them. Most of the puzzles are all intuitive, using the hints and design of the room to logically deduce what the player needs to do. After getting the spear ladder, some walls are not accepting of the stabbing, but the player should quickly figure that out, that any glowing, odd, or metal wall is not happy about the attack. There are plenty of song stones that require the player to logically deduce the notes from the area, as they're never explicitly given. Some of the controls are also hidden, like the recovery options, but they will be explained if talking to the correct person. In all, the game requires plenty of thought, and the answers are almost always simple, except for this puzzle, which is entirely random and will be receiving a cease and desist for all of my mental anguish. The thematics are actually well integrated into the game. Despite the world being overrun with giant blowfish and killer instinct monsters, all the beasts, gremlins, and upgrades are explained in the game at some point, relating back to the ancient inventions or mistakes. The galactic calamity being hidden from the world also makes sense, as these people just want to live their lives and can't be bothered to challenge Sigma when there's plenty of cannoli to be eaten. Gale's powers, super rolling, incredible precision, also explained later in the game, although why no one figured it out before is beyond me. I can explode spears in midair and no one thought that was a little odd. Game's tutorial is designed well to funnel the player into specific areas. Gale cannot leave without a weapon, so we have to go looking for one, then we get to reject the frog's advances. Meanwhile, the player will learn to interact with NPCs, with doors and ladders, and with movable objects. The base controls are directly stated with text, yet do not require the player to stop moving. The player will need to use each of the base controls to leave the first area, forcing them to at least understand the basics before sending them off into the cruel, dark world. The tutorial is well crafted in a railroaded way to ensure that players understand the fundamental concept of the mechanics and controls. It could be improved by giving more area opportunity for the player to explore and test, such as having the dojo master throw Gale, or a spot where crawling or rolling is needed in the initial area, not just the forest. The UI and UX are well crafted to easily digest and navigate the game. The health and stamina are out of the way of the main view, Gale takes up very little space and is easily seen, and the menus have plenty of open space to digest everything. The text in the game is white against a black background, and important words are highlighted blue for easy notice. The menus for the in-game content and settings are organized sensibly, although I'm not sure why the two are separated. The settings could easily be in the other menu without much of an issue. The text and items for the menus are spaced far enough to easily digest, and the text is always at a bottom panel. The overworld is designed uniquely enough so that the different areas are easy to tell, but a map may help players after a long break or when planning efficient runs to know where the major roads are. The difference in color and shading for the foreground and background make them easy to differentiate, although there are a few times where it looks possible to climb on an object, then you plummet down because it was actually a ghost ledge and it pranked you. Gotcha, man. The game is pixel art reminiscent of the 8-bit era with a cartoonish style. Everything is exaggerated, often for humor, and the characters will have wacky hairstyles and interesting hats. Even though pixels, the sprites and models are detailed enough to easily see what is happening. The attacks of the enemies are unique and telegraphed well, and so are Gale's reactions in the conversations because talking is so overrated. The style lends into some of the animations where the movements are exaggerated but not within the uncanny valley. The animations often will have a good bit of extra detail in them as well, like Gale closing her eyes after a robot hurls her, or the utter shock of the bats when they get pelted into oblivion. With one of the patches, the game included a variety of accessibility options for combat, but there were always a few native options that help with general gameplay. There was an option to stop the text from shaking for those with any sort of motion issue, and there's another option for the sharks to not invert the fishing controls, which is a requirement for me as my brain fails to invert controls for an analog stick. There are also plenty of options for slowing certain actions or speeding others up, which can help those with timing issues. There should be far more options for text, like the sound and font and color, to help with the legibility and annoyance, especially since the game is all text and no voice. The game does not allow for remapping controls, which can be a burden. I personally did not like the mapping and I wish I could have changed it more to my liking. For a final score, I give the gameplay a 26 out of 35, story 4 out of 5, sound 4 out of 5, mechanics 26 out of 30, tutorial 4 out of 5, UI UX 4 out of 5, graphics 5 out of 5, and accessibility 3 out of 5. Overall, I'll give the game a 4 out of 5. I personally waited for Phoenotopia Awakening for some years, and I'm glad that it finally came out. It is a good Metrovania with plenty of secrets and random things to do. The NPCs have funny quips and sometimes interesting tricks for the game. There are some serious issues with the frustration and limitations in the combat, and there are points where progress grinds to a halt. It has plenty of replayability and opportunities for personal challenges, but is also daunting because there's so much to collect. The upgrades are nice, but the game balances this out by adding too many enemies, so you never actually feel like you're getting stronger for a while. The bosses are fun, except for the last few who can slap themselves with raw chicken for all I care. The game is a bit rough at times, but my 40-hour journey was mostly filled with enjoyment and a desire to continue on to 100%. Thanks everybody for watching. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, make sure to like, comment, subscribe, and ring the bell to be notified of future videos. But until next time, wale te omnes.